Good morning, church. 2 Corinthians 5. I've been here for a while. Got two more Sundays, two more verses, so two more Sundays. 2 Corinthians 5:20. That's where we are this morning. 2 Corinthians 5:20 says, "We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God." October 26, 1962. How many of you were here then? Raise your hand if you were here. How many were over 10 on October 26th? Okay. All right, so now this is history. Hey, teenagers, you guys should know this. If you don't, we'll get a little history lesson this morning. But actually, does anybody know what October 26, 1962 was in our country's history? What that? No, it wasn't Kennedy, but it's close. Any takers? All right. So the world stage was set October 26, 1962. A gentleman who was sort of washed up in politics, was a two-time loser of the presidential election on the Democratic side of the row, a guy by the name of Adlai Stevenson. Now you're going, oh yeah, now you remember. Adlai was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And Russia had given Cuba some missiles that were aimed at us. And they had more missiles on a ship that was headed to Cuba to arm Fidel Castro so that he could do whatever he wanted, I guess. So essentially, we were on the very footing, the precipice of war as a country with Russia and Cuba. And we had undisputable evidence that there were missiles on this boat that was headed to Cuba, and there was a big stock. We had a big group of ships there as a blockade to keep this ship from coming, and it was getting tense because, as you know, it just gets right up there to the very last minute. And most of the time, the ambassador to the United Nations or any country, there's very few times in our history where there's where they make a huge difference. And October 26 was one of those days. The president, John F. Kennedy, he could have gone to the UN and made a speech. But essentially what they're going to do is they're going to bring the evidence to the world that Russia and Cuba had evil intent towards us. And Adlai makes an impassioned, he was known as a good public speaker, but he wasn't really known as a great politician. And so it was fascinating that JFK allowed him to speak on his behalf, but that's what an ambassador does. And so he goes and he speaks to the United Nations, and he looks at the Russian ambassador and says, "You tell us, do you have missiles headed there or not?" And he said, "Don't wait." The famous quote was, "Don't wait for the translation, just answer yes or no. I can wait until hell freezes over." He tells him right then and there, "I want to know, do you have missiles heading our way or not?" And so here's this representative of the United States, a UN ambassador who most people had sort of forgotten about, is at a critical point in a juncture in our nation's history. And as you know, the Russian, well, maybe you don't know, but the Russian kind of hem-hawed around and said, "Well, not really." And that's when we brought up the pictures. Pictures don't really lie all the time, I guess they can, but in this particular case, the evidence was overwhelming. And it made me think when we're talking about, when Paul says we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, what exactly is an ambassador? Well, the way an ambassador works, an ambassador is set up to represent their country's chief executive. So in this case, John F. Kennedy was the president. Adlai was representing the chief executive, the president. He was speaking on behalf to this audience, this organization that he was a part of. Now, usually an ambassador is one of two things. You're either an ambassador to a country, or you're ambassador to an allied association, for example, the United Nations or NATO. You'd be an ambassador to NATO. In this case, it was he was the ambassador to the United Nations. So think of it in terms of this. This term is hundreds of years old, by the way. This goes back a long way in history where countries would send an ambassador to another country and be the representative of that country. And so this was nothing new, but historically they weren't always that impactful. Well, this is an impactful moment. And so here, think of it in terms of this way. They represent the highest rank of diplomat in a country, representing their country in all matters to the country or organization they're appointed. Ambassadors normally live overseas or within the country or organization that they're assigned to for long periods of time so that they can get acquainted with the culture and the local people. An ambassador has to know his audience. An ambassador should be known by his audience, but he's there representing the highest executive of his country. Often an ambassador is used to negotiate deals or trade deals or peace settlements, or they represent them in both formal and non-formal occasions. But the main thing there is to establish this relationship with another people. Now, Benjamin Franklin, right? You know who Benjamin Franklin was? He was an ambassador. Where was he an ambassador to? Does anybody know? France. Very good. We have some history buffs in here. We were at war with Britain when Benjamin Franklin was an ambassador to France. What's interesting is Benjamin Franklin, he lived there for 11 years. He spoke the language. The people knew who he was. He wrote and published books. He didn't like to do it, but he would publish books and print them and have them printed and in their language or in our language, because it's something that he could do. He was able to do that. He had a real good rapport with the people of France, and as such, he was able to negotiate an alliance with France. So who were we with war in 1783? Who were we still in war with? Britain, right? It was the American Revolution. And here Ben Franklin, our statesman that helped craft the Declaration of Independence, is over in France to build this relationship. He's representing George Washington in France. And in 1783, he's able to use his leverage and draft the Treaty of Paris, which is the treaty that ended the American Revolution. Now that's fascinating. He lived there. He spent time in their culture. He knew them. He spoke to the right people. He found favor. The French weren't ready to get in war with the Brits. They'd gotten beat several times already. And yet Benjamin Franklin was able to establish such a relationship as our ambassador that he got him on board. He signed him up as an ally, and that was really the thing that finally pushed us over victory against the British. Now, so I think when Paul says we are therefore ambassadors, Christ's ambassadors, this is a significant deal. And the first and most obvious implication, if an ambassador represents a country's highest chief executive, if I'm Christ's ambassador, what am I doing? I'm representing the author of life. Paul tells us, tells me, we are therefore Christ's ambassadors. That's me, that's you. We are on mission to reflect Christ in all that we do. And sometimes it may be to go to a third world country. Sometimes that third world country might be your office. We are God's ambassadors. And so there's these significant things as we unpack this. When people come in contact with us, they should see, feel, and know that there's a difference about us. Let me say that again. As an ambassador, when Benjamin Franklin, they knew who he was. He was the celebrated American who had taken the time to learn their language and be a part of their culture and really try to make a difference in their lives. People recognize him. When we're out in the marketplace, people should see, know, and feel a difference in our lives based on our representation. I'm Christ's ambassador. You're Christ's ambassador. So let's unpack that a little bit. When our actions are less than flattering out in the marketplace, what's changed? Certainly not our chief executive. Christ is the same, but we are out there representing, and so sometimes there's these less than flattering. I've seen Christian coaches in Little League, guys that were supposedly the best, loving the Lord, just absolutely lose it over a Little League game. Our relationship, we are Christ's ambassadors, whether we're doing it in a positive way or negative way, we are representing Christ. And all the research shows people aren't coming to churches not because of our lack of programs or our preachers or they're coming because they know us. They're not coming because they know us. They see us in less than flattering lights. And the call here is, Paul says, we are Christ's ambassadors. And less than flattering, God hasn't changed. We have. And our job is to represent and reflect him in a healthy way. Now here's a couple points. Our outward appearance should be impacted by our inward connection. Our outward appearance should be impacted by our inward connection. And our outward actions, the things that we do, we shouldn't not only look different, but we should be different. Our outward actions should be impacted by what we learned last week when Paul says, we have been committed the ministry and the message of reconciliation. I don't know why God chose me. I don't know why God chose you. But he did. If you've embraced the claims of Christ, if you become a Christ follower and Christ lives in you, you have a job. You're Christ's ambassador to the world. To the world. And our outward appearance and our outward actions should reflect a dynamic relationship with God. And we're called to get outside of our comfort zone. An ambassador is not really needed in their home. Ambassadors, the whole point of having an ambassador is someone who would be out about representing. Because John F. Kennedy, he can't be everywhere. George Washington couldn't be in France developing an ally. He needed someone he could trust, so he sends a trusted friend to France to develop this relationship so that our country as a whole could survive and we could win this war. And he sends him out. When God says we are Christ's ambassadors, we've got to get out of our comfort zone. We're not needed here. This is nice. This is good, but this isn't where we're needed. You're not in your ambassador role this morning. You're in your receiving, celebrating, worshiping mode. When you walk out the doors, your job's on. And it's not going to be comfortable. So think about what that looks like. And we are called to be familiar and understand the culture of those that look around us. And here's some differences. There's a food and dress culture difference. Now, what do I mean by that? I'll give you an example. When I went to grad school in Fort Worth and I started working in the golf industry and started hanging around golf pros, they have a certain look about them. They wore these shoes called teaching shoes, and I'd never seen them. They were a mix between a dress shoe and a tennis shoe, and you'd have nice, that's a whole different culture. That's who they were. They acted around the dinner table differently than me. But here I am as Christ's ambassador thrown right in the middle of these people who don't know the Lord, and they dress differently than me, and their eating habits are differently. The dinner table is different. I'm used to a celebration, a thankfulness of God for our food, and being around Christians, and we talk about that food is just fuel for them. So there's a difference. So there's a food and a dress culture. There's a language barrier. There's a language culture. It could be outright, for example, Spanish, French, Chinese. If I'm going to go live in China and work, there's a language barrier there. But when we're Christ's ambassadors, we're not all called to go to China. Some of you are Christ's ambassadors down the street at the dry cleaners. And yet, there's a language that people speak that are different. Go back to being in the golf world. There is language that's specific for most industries. I changed jobs this year and started at the Soderquist Leadership Center and go to our first meeting, and they're using these acronyms. I'm going, huh? Well, they knew what they were. It was inherent for the operations of their business. But I'm an outsider. I've got to learn the language of their culture. And when God says you're going to be an ambassador, there are certain things you need to know. And you need to be aware of the culture that I'm sending you, that you're representing in. Because it's different in food and dress and language. And sometimes it's a foreign language. Sometimes it's just learning how to speak to them. There are religious implications too. I mean, there's the growth of world religions. Muslim is one of the fastest growing religions in the world. Mormonism. We've given up ground as Christ's ambassadors on our understanding of how to communicate to people that look at the world differently. Let me say that again. Put it in different perspective. When a Jehovah's Witness comes and knocks on our door, most of us send them away. Yeah, thanks for coming. See, I'm not interested. No, I don't want your literature. Or if you're like me, you take it so you can go throw it away so nobody else gets it. But we don't engage. You know why? Because we don't know. So when God says you're an ambassador, and part of being an ambassador is to try to seek to understand where people are coming from. And so some of us in this auditorium should learn how to communicate to a Mormon. We should learn how to communicate to a Muslim because they're on the road to eternity apart from God. They don't know Him. And if I'm going to be Christ's ambassador, I need to seek to understand as best I can in the places that God has sent me. And so if you're in a place where someone speaks a little bit different, dresses a little bit different, talks a little bit different, and you find yourself in that environment a lot, learn the language, learn the culture. Like, for example, duck hunting. I'm not a duck hunter. But people that are really into it, they buy the boats and the camo and the gun. I'd show up in my blue jeans and a shirt and go, hey, are we ready to go? You got to learn to speak the lingo and the language and adopt that. The Bible tells us we're not to be of the world, but we are in the world. And to be in it, to be a representative is tricky. I've got to be out there. We don't represent among ourselves. We're the holy huddle. And God says there are going to be some language, some dress, some food. There's going to be religious implications of understanding and seeking people that believe differently but don't believe correctly. And then there's going to be some comfort differences. It's not easy when you think about getting up in the morning and putting on the armor of Christ and saying, God, I want to go out and be a representative for you today. And realize that if you go out in an audience that doesn't know Christ, it's not going to be very easy. And probably, most likely, according to scriptures, it's going to be very difficult. If it's to go to a third world, like Honduras or something like that, you realize that the comfort and conveniences of America is very rare. We have hot water. We have a roof over our head that doesn't leak. We have carpet or wood or tile in our homes. Most of us have one car. Most people in the world have 2.5 changes of clothes and live on $1.25 a day. So if I'm going to be an ambassador to the world, it's going to be uncomfortable. If I'm going to be an ambassador at work, it's probably going to be uncomfortable. And yet that's exactly what Paul tells us. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors. And there are some implications there. So to be an ambassador, we have to be ready not only to understand the differences and challenges, but we must be active at overcoming them. There are challenges, and we've got to be active. So here's a couple examples. Thanksgiving Day. It's full at your house, isn't it? It's busy. There's usually people. It's usually family, sometimes not. But it's a feast. You know what should be normal for Christians? Going to the soup kitchen and volunteering for 2 hours to serve those that don't have family or friends. That should be normal. It's very uncomfortable, isn't it? Break up my family tradition. But that's a way to be an ambassador of Christ. To go visit the cancer center over here on 412 and volunteer to drive chemo patients home, the ones that don't have cars. Poor people get cancer too, and they have huge needs. That should be as normal as breathing for us. Going to Honduras like Kathy did a couple months ago and standing on your feet all day, realizing that the short-term health benefits that the people are going to receive, it's not going to keep them very long. But it's worth it for the chance to share the gospel of hope with them. Stand on your feet and work all day. Not easy. Very difficult. And yet we're called to represent. We do it anyway. To learn a new language so you engage people that you can't currently communicate with. That's a mandate. It's not a suggestion. Springdale is full of people that speak another language. And yes, it's okay to house and to hope and to inspire by starting a Hispanic church. Learn languages. Learn to speak. Make an attempt. You're never too old. It's never too late. That's a significant way to overcome it. So I want to compare and contrast here two looks at ministry. I'm just going to read them parallel to one another. We're going to make some assumptions. But I want you to kind of see, one is an engaging ministry of what being an ambassador might look like, and one is being a disengaged minister of being what a churchgoer might look like. And it might make you a little uncomfortable, but I just want to read the scriptures to you, and we'll go from there. In Mark chapter 2, later, Levi invited Jesus and his disciples to his home as his dinner guest, along with many tax collectors and other disreputable sinners. There were many people of that kind among Jesus' followers. But when the teachers of religious law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with tax collectors and other sinners, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with such scum?" Flip that over on Mark 12. Jesus also taught, Beware the teachers of religious law, for they like to parade around in flowing robes and receive respectful greetings as they walk in marketplaces, and how they love the seats of honor in the synagogues and the head table in the banquets. Two pictures. One's engaged. Jesus is engaged. It says there were many people this kind, disreputable sinners. And there were many people like that in Jesus' followers. The religious people, they love to wear their religious garb and look good. Different. Luke 19, when Jesus came by, he looked up at Zacchaeus and called him by name. Zacchaeus, quick, come down. I must be a guest in your home today. Zacchaeus quickly climbed down the tree and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. But the people, not the religious leaders, the people were displeased. He has gone home to be the guest of a notorious sinner, they grumbled. Disengaged ambassador. Compare that to the religious. Then Jesus told the story to some who had great confidence in their own righteousness and scored everyone else. Two men went to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee and the other was a despised tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed this prayer: I thank you, God, that I am not a sinner like everyone else, for I don't cheat, I don't sin, I don't commit adultery. I'm certainly not like this tax collector over here. I fast twice a week and I give 1/10 of my income. But the tax collector stood a distance and dared not even lift his eyes to heaven as he prayed. Instead, he beat his chest in sorrow, saying, Oh God, be merciful to me, I am a sinner. I tell you, this sinner, not the Pharisee, returned home justified before God. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. There's a stark contrast between being an ambassador to those that need it and being religious. There's a stark contrast. Paul closes chapter 5 out with a line in the sand. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors. We represent the chief executive of the universe. And that looks messy sometimes. We are appointed, we're given the title, assigned the task, sent to represent. That's mission at its very heart. Think of it this way. Our win is you and I as Christ followers, if you find yourself here today as someone who considers themselves to be a Christ follower and has accepted what Christ did, the work that Christ did for you on the cross, that paid for your sins, you embrace those, you receive him to cover the debt you could never pay, and you stand today as one of the redeemed. If that's you, if that's who you are, your win is you get to spend eternity in heaven with him. It doesn't stop there. We're supposed to take as many with us as we can. Let me say that again. Our win is that we get to spend eternity from God, but we're supposed to be bringing as many with us. As ambassadors, we're representing Christ to these people who are going to spend eternity apart from God. And my job, your job, is to pull them with us. Go take them kicking and screaming. Get involved. Be a part of what God is asking you to do. Here's what it's not. Being an ambassador is not being a part of a church that have big buildings to celebrate those buildings. It's not perfect Sunday school attendance. It's not budgets in the black. It's not fancy signs advertising our church. It's not a great music, children's youth program. All those things are good. It's none of that. Being an ambassador of Christ is much bigger than that. It's not having exclusivity of Christian friends. Now, this is going to be a little bit uncomfortable for you. But I believe and I see and I feel, and part of it's in my own journey, it's so much easier to engage Christians and talk about our journey together. Man, I'm struggling with this. Will you pray with me? And we come along each other and we do this part of the equation really well. So much so that our small groups, our Sunday school classes, our church auditoriums are filled with all of us. And we could never be accused of doing the two examples I shared with you of Jesus a minute ago, going into the homes of notorious sinners. That accusation could never be leveled against most of us because we don't do it. We have too much fun in our club. So we call them church, but really they're clubs. They're Christian clubs. And you know, we make fun of other clubs. Well, that club's so big that if you went there, they wouldn't even know you. Right? We talk about the club down the street because that pastor such and such, he's got a real problem. We talk about our own club, so much so that we sit in our same pews and our same chairs, and if somebody comes in and tries to sit in our chair, oh my, what are you doing? So guests may not even feel welcome in our own club. We may not find disreputable sinners and notorious sinners in our midst because we wouldn't dare invite them because they're not going to look exactly like us. And we would be offended if they walked in if they didn't look and act just like we do. We are God's ambassadors. Our marching orders are not to change who he was and what he did. Our marching orders are to represent him well to the best of our ability and have it look like what he did. And what he did was he spent time with his 12. He spent time, the Bible talks about he had many followers, but along the way they would leave because he would go touch an unclean person, or he would talk to the lady at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well. Jesus interacted with lost people his entire 3 years of ministry. There's more stories about him engaging people that the religious wouldn't touch. They were offended constantly in the scripture. Why did you heal that man? Why did you say that man's sins were forgiven? Why did you talk to that lady? They were offended. But they were religious. They looked good. They had the pedigree. Their church was there. Their temple was there. They had all the markings, but they weren't representing. You and I are called to represent. We don't change his policy. We don't change his plan. We don't even have to change his message. We tell the story. I love what Kevin said a couple weeks ago. Tell the story what God has done for you. Now, the end of the verse there in 20 tells us all we need. It tells us, he says, be therefore ambassadors of Christ as if we are making the appeal for Christ. Now, what is an appeal? An appeal is it's requesting a formal change or decision. You and I are supposed to say, we are supposed to appeal to the people that don't know him and say, please, I beg you, turn from your sin and receive Christ. That's uncomfortable, isn't it? We attend church a lot, for many of us, most of our life, but if the subject of conversion comes up on the dinner table, most of us are uncomfortable talking about it. Am I wrong? And yet, we are, he says, be reconciled to God. We are God's ambassadors. Now listen, here's what you're ending. You're ending the separation. If you represent well and someone turns from God, you're ending their separation that they have from a God that desperately loves them. You're ending the darkness for them. Because the Bible says they are in darkness. We're going to read that in just a second. And you're ending the brokenness that they find themselves in. That's what you're doing. Listen to it in Ephesians 2. As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and the ruler of the kingdom of the air and the spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. All of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts like the rest, who were by nature deserving of wrath. But listen to this. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in our transgressions. To be an ambassador of Christ is to end the death that people apart from him are going to experience. That's your job. Now, you may voice that you don't want that job. You may not even like it. It might be uncomfortable for you, but you got it. If you're a Christ follower, that's your job. We, therefore, are Christ's ambassadors, as though we were making an appeal for someone to change their life and their decision about spending eternity apart from God or eternity with God. Represent to the Christ to the world, and this is important, and support those. Represent Christ to the world, be an ambassador, and support those who don't, where you can't go or won't go. So and that's a little nuance there. But we're to be God's ambassadors. Sometimes there are people that are willing to do it just a little bit more than me. And so maybe you need to support those people because you can't go or you won't go. But you can go. So here's a couple of closing thoughts. You don't age out of the job. This one doesn't go away. Being an ambassador is being an ambassador because, remember, the Bible tells us we are temporary citizens. Once we become Christ followers, this is no longer our home. This is not the end. We are representing the chief executive of the world, of the universe. And this is a temporary dwelling. And our job is to be Christ's ambassadors from the day we receive Christ to the day he takes us home. You don't age out of the job. You don't need a lot of knowledge. This is interesting. We study, we listen, we read, and we get so much knowledge, but we're still uncomfortable talking about it. Really? You don't need knowledge, you need love. Jesus went to Zacchaeus' home, not because he was the theological leader of the world. He went to his home because he loved him. He had disreputable sinners all around him because he loved them. And that's what we're supposed to be. It's unlikely that it will be easy for you and for me. But we are therefore Christ's ambassadors. That is mission. That is love. So, for a time of invitation, here's my plea to you. We have 2 weeks before Easter. And as you know, 2 Sundays a year get lots and lots of attention from the outside world. Easter and Christmas. And sometimes we wait and we think, well, the minister or the message of music will do all the work for us. You know what being an ambassador is? It's not standing up and preaching. It's not sharing the message through song. You're the ambassador. But one of the things that you can do is begin now to pray about people you know that don't know him and invite them. It's an easy way. It's a close way. When Jeff leads the choir, they're going to hear the message of the gospel. Maybe you're not quite there where you want to jump in and be the vocal representative I know you can be. Well, that's an easy thing for you to do. They're going to come anyway, or more people are going to come anyway. But here's an opportunity to use the Easter story and engage people that for once, maybe twice in their year, they'll pause for a minute to think about something other than themselves. So my invitation to you is, are you involved like you ought to be? What can you do in the next 2 weeks that will be uncomfortable but will represent well? What can you do this week that you didn't do last week to share the good news, to be an ambassador? Be obedient, be involved, get out and get going. Let's stand and pray.